What's happening, everybody? John Hendrix here with Saints News Network alongside Ross Jackson, always the very, very smiley Ross Jackson. And he is just, we're all operating off of coffee. It's been a long week, but a good week that we've had at the Senior Bowl. Ross, you're still over in Mobile and on this fine Friday, but how's things going over there?
Yeah, great. This is mostly the festivities day and stuff like that. So it's a good time to hang around, maybe get to chat up with some of the prospects and stuff, whether out at the parades and all that. So always a lot of fun to kind of be here through the end of it. I'm never staying for the game, however, so I'll be out tomorrow morning.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's kind of a limited type seating. I think we got everything that you need during the week here. It's a
Mhm.
great process that's ran by Jim Nagy and his company, his crew, and such that they do here, and just a interesting perspective. And I guess for those who don't know, and we're going to get into plenty of Saints talk. We're going to talk about all the fun stuff, but this is over 100 college prospects, right? And last year they only had what two first rounders, and this year they have over 10
Yep.
first round potential picks that are in this. Tons of names on here, tons of big top tier talent. I love the fact that they went to the new format where they have coaches from everywhere, not just one
hmm
particular team that's doing it, but just kind of maybe give your thoughts on the Senior Bowl process. I mean, you've been doing this for a long time now, too, and it's a long time, meaning over 5 years, right? So this is kind of
hmm
a thing that I think gets better with every year that passes.
Yeah, I think that the couple of changes that they've made recently that I really like, I love the change to the coaching staff, as you mentioned. We're not watching like two of the bottom coaching staffs that finish towards the bottom in the NFL. I mean, come out here and work with these guys. We're actually now watching coaching staff members who were nominated by other coaching staff members to represent, and even oftentimes, and most of the time, actually, kind of operate at a promoted level here at the Senior Bowl. So, for instance, for some Saints examples, last year, offensive assistant DJ Williams, who works with the quarterbacks but isn't a quarterback coach in the NFL, was the quarterback coach for the Senior Bowl and for one of the teams. Ronald Curry, who's the quarterback coach, passing game coordinator for the New Orleans Saints, he was offensive coordinator last year. This year, assistant special teams coach Phil Galliano out here as the special teams coach for one of these teams. So everybody kind of gets to operate as like a promoted, kind of in a promoted role, which is really cool to see. It just gives people a little bit more exposure, a little bit more opportunity, all that as well. The other thing that I really like this year, and I think it only happened to about the tune of maybe 11 or so players, but they started allowing underclassmen in this year's
Mhm.
class as well. So it's not just the Senior Bowl for seniors; it's the Senior Bowl
Right.
for draft prospects. And I think that was a really wise move by Jim Nagy in the Senior Bowl as they continue to expand their sort of player pool. This is the all-star game effectively that you want to be a part of if you're a college player, because the percentages of folks that come from here to being drafted in the NFL draft is astronomical. And this is a weekend that everybody, coaches, players, prospects, everybody wants to be a part of.
Yeah, you got like the Shrine Bowl, you got the Collegiate Bowl, the Hula Bowl, you got the HBCU Legacy Bowl that's coming. You got all these, but like I think this is probably the premier event. Not that saying that
hmm
they won't get talent from everyone, but again, you talk about the Saints, they had a heavy presence here, right? Everybody but
Yep.
Dennis Allen was practically in the building. You got to see all the position coaches. Mickey Loomis is here. Now, DA was obviously not in attendance for good reason because they were doing the offensive coordinator search. He's doing the interviews and such. But I say that because everybody says, well, yeah, it makes sense, proximity, but there were some teams out there that weren't represented or they have minimal
Like at all.
representation. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't know how you do that, but again, and it's what's interesting about it is that for those who again don't understand, this is the coaching staff's first look at all of these prospects, right? It's not
Yep.
like they've been researching these guys or talking about it. That's the scouting department's job, Jeff Ireland and that team that does all that work. But for really these coaches, this is the first time they meet these players. And look, in talking to some of these coaches, right? They look at film. Obviously, they're not going
hmm
to sit here and say, "Oh, well, let me just take down everything in a moment." They're going to interview prospects too. But it's interesting on some of the nuances that you pick up where if you make a bad play, they're going to notice and they're going to stick out and they're going to put a little mark on their thing, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a fine tooth comb, even if it's not happening in the moment. I think it's kind of one of those things that becomes like the big difference between sort of the draft evaluating crowd and then the NFL crowd, right? Coaches and things like that. There's always eventually a certain point to where coaches are looking at the draft one way, media and everybody's looking at the draft the other way, and then eventually media catches up. Well, a big part of the reason why the media eventually has to catch up is because of the years of advanced work that have already been happening on these prospects when it's from the scouts, as you mentioned. The coaches pick it up very quickly, but then they go back and they study and study and study the tape. And then, of course, like people can effectively make a little bit of money here at the Senior Bowl. They can lose a little bit of money here at the Senior Bowl in terms of like what their draft stock is and things like that. But ultimately, the decision is going to be made based upon what their tape in college says. These 3 days, though, you also get to learn a little bit about the makeup of the player. There's a guy, edge rusher Leatu Latu out of UCLA, who received a bunch of praise from a bunch of scouts and coaches that I talked to because he was literally going to anybody that was a former player and asking, hey, what advice do you have for me? What can I do this week? That would be good. He was asking media guys that were former players, like, give me a little bit of advice here. Like, that kind of thing stands out. So you get to see the makeup of that player. You get to see how they take to coaching, how they work with unfamiliar players. Because when you're a rookie drafted into the NFL, you got to be able to do that. You're about to work with a bunch of guys you've never worked with before. Can you turn that page quickly? Those are some of the things you get to learn here at the Senior Bowl that almost become more important than what you do in terms of production and your one-on-ones and things like that.
Yeah, and it's a certain level of humbleness, right? Because you can come in here and have a big chip on your shoulder and be like, I know I'm going to go with top 10, top 15 or anything, but to be able to pick these guys' minds, that's a huge thing, right? And people that have walked it and done it, bought the t-shirt. I mean, you're talking about coaches that have over 30 years of experience, some 10 years plus as a player. I mean, it's limitless, the amount of talent that's around this event. And I don't want to say little old Mobile, but Mobile, you just look at everything and it's just like, it's not a Las Vegas, it's not a Texas, it's not all those types of things, but it makes sense, and it's a great exposure. It's a great time for all of these college prospects. And look, again, you look at it, you're going to get all the stuff that hey, so and so look good in this, the one-on-ones, all this type of stuff, which makes sense, right? In a sense, it's kind of like what we see at training camp. These guys stick out, all that type of stuff. That's the type of thing that we look at. And again, there's 100 plus college prospects. I think it was 120 is on the roster is what I remember. And obviously some aren't participating. Some aren't doing everything that they should. Some get hurt. We saw plenty of that. But, again, for the Saints, they have a heavy presence here. They are, not some that are just new to this equation. They just come in here, they learn as much as they can, and then really they're going to lean more on the combine for a lot more evaluations. But again, Saints offensive coordinator, I think that's the hottest topic right now. We'll get into some of the other stuff, but offensive coordinator search, again, everything that I understood and was told that they were getting close to hiring a offensive coordinator, pretty close. And I know a lot of people are antsy about not making hires. You got Gerard Johnson that steps back, Ben Johnson staying with the Lions, all these types of different things. It seems like they're honing in on their guys. The hottest name that I keep hearing is Clint Kubiak. What do you think is the Saints' best course here? And do they even look at a guy like Ronald Curry and say, okay, maybe this is what we feel like this should be all along, and he's maybe the rest of these candidates are kind of having to stack up to him?
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't rule out Ronald Curry at all. I think that's a fine plan for the New Orleans Saints. You kind of wonder why they didn't make that change in season, but look, they were very clear that they weren't going to be making any type of coaching changes or making any kind of drastic moves in season. So going to a guy like Ronald Curry could make sense. But I do think that it's the external hire, and I'm with you right there, John. Everybody that I talked to has talked about Clint Kubiak. Clint Kubiak, Clint Kubiak, Clint Kubiak. That's the name that continuously comes up when it comes to the New Orleans Saints. I've heard some folks, I still hear the name John Gruden pop up and stuff like that, but I don't, he hasn't really been linked to this offensive coordinator role. He's been linked to maybe another role on offense, something like a senior offensive assistant or something like that, if that even were to come to fruition. That report was from, months ago now. But when it comes down to where the Saints seem to be when it comes to offensive coordinator, it feels very much like Clint Kubiak's the target, which would explain the timeline. Like, they didn't offer, my understanding is that they didn't offer the job to Gerard Johnson. They didn't offer the job necessarily to any of these other candidates that they've talked to. And so this kind of gives you a little bit more clarity about why the Saints are taking the time that they're taking, because maybe their top candidate and the guy that they either hope to land or expect to land is going to be busy coaching in the Super Bowl, on February 11th. And so they don't want to create the, I'm sure Kubiak and the San Francisco 49ers wouldn't want to create the distraction for their team and their roster, getting ready to play the biggest game of their careers, biggest game of their lives. You don't want to create any distraction in which you're kind of going, oh, well, our guy's leaving us. You know what I mean? And so instead, you wait until that game is over, and then probably February 12th, the day after the Super Bowl, might be when that news could break. But that's kind of the way that I would see that panning out if Clint Kubiak is indeed the guy for the New Orleans Saints. If he's not, then you're waiting to kind of see maybe like what some of those other possibilities are between him and, let's say, Brian Greasy, who of course came in and interviewed as well. But yeah, everything that I've heard so far has been at least that Clint Kubiak is the candidate, the guy that they're gunning for.
Yeah, that honing in, and of course, we'll see how it obviously plays out. But Ronald Curry, to his credit, I mean, he's been with his team for a long time. He actually calls plays in preseason a lot of times too. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's another thing, that it's not like he's just vanilla to it. Drew Brees opening his small sliders or sliders business yesterday, talking about Curry. I mean, he has glowing praise, and again, but like you said, if that was the guy, then why hadn't it been done, sooner and all that? That's the kind of the biggest thing. And it seems like, well, you did all this research, you did all these interviews. I mean, they were up well over 10. I mean, almost to 15 candidates, right, that are linked to this job. And there's a ton of them that are open, 13, 14 were open, as many as 15. I mean, that's a lot of guys to fill up, and they have to get it right, because this is, for all intents and purposes, I think this is DA's last chance to really get this roster where it needs to. I know that they've kind of put some lines in the sands as far as what they've constructed in the locker room and some different things that they've kind of echoed in and talked in on. And, in talking about that, I think some of these players' futures are really in question. I think Michael Thomas, the thing that happened with him doing his rant on X or Twitter now, I think he's gone. I think the best course of action for them, and again, everything that I hear and have heard, is that I think that they're going to be heading, I don't want to say divorce, but it's time to move on. It's time for something fresh. But I don't think it stops there, because I think Marshawn Lattimore is another one that you look at. I think that's another one that it wouldn't surprise me if they move on from Marshawn Lattimore. But what are your thoughts, and kind of what are some of the things that you've been hearing?
Yeah, I've been hearing the same things. Michael Thomas in particular, like that's one, to be fair, that's one that we all kind of understood. Okay, the swan song is the 2023 season. They brought him in, they did the incentive heavy contract, all that. He got through 10 games, didn't hit a single one of those incentives, wasn't able to finish the year on the field. And it's unfortunate because he worked very hard to get back. You know what I mean? Like, I want to be careful about how I talk about this, because I don't think necessarily that Michael Thomas did anything wrong. I think that he's just in a situation to where, like, his body is not doing the thing that his mind wants his body to do. And unfortunately, that's just the case sometimes when it comes to the game of football. And maybe he lands somewhere else and there's a different system that works out well for him, and then he's able to stay healthy. That doesn't mean that he would have stayed healthy here in New Orleans. So I think at this point, you're operating to try to be as early on this as possible, because you might already be too late if you're the New Orleans Saints. It's been 4 seasons now of him either not being on the field or not being able to finish on the field. I understand the frustration there. I understand the frustration from Michael Thomas there too, but it just doesn't seem like these two, the New Orleans Saints and Michael Thomas, it doesn't feel like it's in the stars for them to give this another run. It feels like it's an opportunity for Michael Thomas to start fresh, and the Saints to continue to build on a really talented young core of wide receivers that they have in Chris Olave, A.T. Perry, and then we'll have Rashid Shaheed back in 2024 as well. He's an exclusive rights free agent, which means the two don't even have to look at each other. Like Rashid and the Saints don't even have to talk to one another, they have to look at each other, and he will be back in 2024. So it's a super easy situation to navigate. So you got a lot of talent there. Add more young talent to it. See if maybe you land a big fish in free agency like a T. Higgins or something like that to give you that X receiver presence, and then move on. And I think that that's the right way to go here. The Marshawn Lattimore one's a little bit more complicated, just because it would probably be a trade situation. They've already kind of redid his contract, which will allow them to carry him all the way down to after June 1st, which will give them the opportunity to defer some of that salary cap payment. So it makes it a little bit more manageable, but it's still over $30 million in total in terms of dead money. You know what I mean? It it's still a lot to take on. So I don't know that I would say that trading away Marshawn Lattimore is the right choice. But I do think that, like, if you look at the talent that they have on the team, the success that they've had without him on the field and all that, like, I could understand why this team would have the confidence to say, hey, we could get this done and get some assets for, a star corner in the NFL. And we've got other star corners, so let's get it done. I could see the logic in that, but I don't know if it's the right choice.
Yeah, and look, here's the reality of it. And I get it. So people have talked about it and said injury prone, all this stuff. Again, I've said it. It's not his fault he's missed half the games right now. As
Right.
far as the rehab stuff, I mean, like this last year, he had friendly fire, he got rolled up in Indy. I understand that. And then the year before that, he was playing out of position, trying to make a play, compensate for somebody who wasn't doing their job and got hurt in the end zone. I mean, those are types of things that, I don't think it's fair to say this guy's injury prone just because now the way back to him, way back getting to the field and all that, maybe you say, okay, well, maybe he could have been available sooner. And I think DA kind of alluded to some of that, possibly having these guys a little bit earlier than they expected, for the rehab process and such. But, look, it's an interesting, dilemma that they have, but I think they have some capable corners on the roster. They have some capable talent. Now, of course, free agency is obviously a big one. Isaac Yadam, look, this is a guy who worked with Joe Woods and been in Denver. So
Yep.
he's gotten the max return from a guy like Joe Woods. And so I think it makes sense. And I've wrote about it plenty, is that could be a thought process. Now, again, dead money. I remember the days when the Saints just had piles and piles of dead money. When they got rid of Jarius Byrd, when they got rid of Junior
Yeah.
Gillette. I don't think the dead money is as big of a problem. They don't have a lot to deal with this year. It's Bradley Roby, and I forgot one other player that they're having to deal with in the dead money. But it wouldn't shock me at that point, and they're going to have to do some things to navigate it. And then you mentioned the wide receiver front; they still got to find a wide receivers coach, which I think, I don't want to say pairing with him and an offensive coordinator, but I think that's something you got to look at. Rashid Shaheed, I know people are talking about the exclusive rights. What I had wrote about him is that they just need to do right by him. They don't. It's a take it or leave it type approach, but the right move would be saying, okay, Rashid, you made the Pro Bowl, you've done all this stuff. We're going to give you a lot more than just some basic bare minimum type thing. Give them some extra incentives, something. I think that's, and the organization is going to do that. But there's just too much. There's too many moving parts and pieces. And obviously, they've already worked on starting to get under the salary cap. Jameis Winston, Marshawn Lattimore. But, again, Derek Carr is the hot name. I think it's something that when you looked at the salary cap and the way that they can restructure, Derek Carr was the top target. I mean, it's been floated that that's where they're going to go. I don't think I treat that as new news. That just made sense from a financial perspective, that if you're going to clear $80+ million, Derek Carr is probably your top target to do that.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, you're going to save over $21 million, over $20 million by restructuring him. Then if you add another void year to the contract to like spread everything out, if you convert it to a salary or to a signing bonus, you'll save a little bit more as well. That helps you get from $84 million to 20 or to 60, $62 million over the salary cap. That's a big leap. And you're right. This contract was always built specifically with the idea of restructuring Derek Carr. There was really no mystery about this, and that they were going to be tied to Derek Carr for 2024, tied to Derek Carr for 2025. And then they can make a decision after that about how they want to handle it, or make a decision before 2025, depending upon what they plan to do with the money in that year's contract, which also carries, I believe, a roster bonus and things like that, which means already guaranteed money effectively that you're just restructuring and turning into guaranteed money at a payout basis as opposed to in a full like lump sum basis. So this isn't really super surprising, but it was a decision that the Saints did need to make. There was a path to restructuring there is a path to restructuring enough around Derek Carr without touching his contract to get under the salary cap. But if you want to add more talent, $21 million moves the needle for you, man, in terms of like how you want to do that and add that talent. So I do think that goes a really long way. And to your point about Rashid Shaheed too, about the exclusive rights situation, Carl Granderson and Juwan Johnson were both examples of the Saints who had the ability to just give them that exclusive rights tender, move on, but instead gave them each, I believe it was 2-year deals, both of them, the opportunity to stick around longer. And then, of course, Carl Granderson turned that into a much larger deal. So I wouldn't be surprised to see them take the same approach there with Rashid Shaheed. But you're right. The Derek Carr thing was expected all along, but, good to know now that you can start to plan for it.
Absolutely. And something else you talked about when it comes to wide receivers is you mentioned T. Higgins, which I love that one. I don't know. I don't know that they'll make the big splash when it comes to a free agent and wide receiver. They have so many pressing needs, right? But one, obviously, I think that would make the most sense is Hunter Renfrow. He's going to get cut by the Raiders. He's somebody that the Saints tried to at least make some calls on when it was a trade deadline and get some interest there. That wouldn't be a surprise to reunite with Derek Carr. That would give him a wide receiver for somebody who can do a little bit of everything. I think that would be a smart move for them to look at, obviously. But, I think their tension has to go on the offensive line. I would love for him to swing for the fences and somebody on the defensive line. I would love for them to
Yeah.
come away with a Daniil Hunter. I don't know if it's going to happen. I never say never, but I think they need a game changer there. But when you look at the offensive line, they got to figure out what to do with Andres Pete, Trevor Penning. Obviously, I thought it was interesting to hear Jeff Ireland talk about Penning and just everybody talk about Penning. Is that they haven't given up. That's something that Ireland has said, Mickey said, Da has talked about. But the other part of it is he could change positions. Obviously, it's going to be up to Doug Moreau and Kevin Carberry to try to get the most from him. Does Trevor Penning work at guard is my first question. And what do you think is going to end up happening, I guess, on the offensive line?
Yeah, I'm a very staunch, like, let tackles play tackle kind of guy.
Yeah,
He's got no experience on the interior. So this would be akin to Alontae Taylor moving to the slot on one off season of that
yeah,
decision, right? And so if you're moving Trevor Penning to guard, are you moving him to guard in one off season, or are you creating him, or are you like moving him to that position but not starting him? And in which case you're still kind of coming up short in terms of what the expectation should be for a top 20 offensive tackle in the NFL. And so I don't know. I get the idea, and I see where people say because of his physicality, because he's a run blocker and things like that, that maybe he can work on the inside. It's also just a thing that people say when tackles struggle. It's always the first
yeah,
thing that comes up. Oh, move him
yeah.
inside. You know what I mean? But he's never done it before. It, I don't have that the kind of faith that says, "Oh yeah, that would happen or that would work out." I think that you work on him at tackle. He's had one off season so far. Give him another one at tackle. Don't waste an off season of him, especially if he can stay healthy throughout it. Splitting focus between two different spots. Get him trained up at tackle, and then see what you're able to turn him into. Can he be the guy that you went out there and drafted him to be? I think that's the question you have to answer first. I don't think they have that answer. Then after you get that answer, yes or no, if it's no, then talk about moving him inside.
Yeah, and I mean, he knows his shortcomings. I mean, he always talked about it in the locker room. Footwork is one of those things. Just being able quicker to diagnose and stuff. I mean, they could look at right tackle. I know that they feel good about Ryan Ramczyk coming back, and Ramczyk feels good about coming back as well. And so I think it's a dilemma. But that offensive line, I mean, I think you didn't get as much as you needed from Ruiz and McCoy this year. But again, I think
Right.
Pete was your best offensive lineman, and so they need proper attention to make this all work on offense. But again, I look at the defensive side of the ball. You look at most of this roster's coming back. Again, there's question marks. There could be some surprise candidates. I think the defensive line, you got to figure out somebody. You got to get a game changer. I really love what they did with Brian Brzee. I think he was, for as much flack as they take for a first rounder and not hitting on him, they absolutely nailed their evaluation on him and Jordan
Yep.
Howden for sure. And
Yeah, for
so
sure.
you want to see more from Isaiah Foskey. And obviously they're not giving up on him, but the pro game is obviously a lot different. And I've said this too, is, you got 2 picks within the top 50, then you're not going to draft again until day 3, presumably with the 5th round, unless you move some players. And so you can't go with the project that has the best RAS score from the small school. You have to go with
Agreed.
somebody, trust your gut, trust your evaluation process, and get the guy who's going to fit your mold of what you need. Because I think they're in the compete now. I don't want to say win now mode, because I don't think this team is primed or ready anywhere for a Super Bowl yet. You got to get the playoffs first, but you got to
Right.
get those pieces around you. I think they love the young core that they have, and they can build on it. But they got a lot of older guys on this roster, and they're going to have to make some decisions. I think defensively, I think there's some surprise cuts coming. I think offensively, there might be some things that you have to deal with and figure out. Do they move a Taysom Hill? I don't know if that's the question. I think they got to get more from Alvin Kamara. I think that starts with getting a better offensive line. I like what
Yep.
they had with Kendre Miller. Jamal Williams didn't have the best year. So that's why I say I think the offensive line is probably the most important position, but it doesn't stop there.
Yeah, no, not at all. There's spots that you're looking at. Where can you get faster? Where can you get younger? Where can you develop more talent? All that. One of the spots that I'm going to be watching over the course of the offseason is safety, right? You've got
Mhm.
Marcus May getting into his 30s. You got Tyrann Mathieu into his 30s. Tyrann Mathieu played a fantastic season last year.
Yes.
Not a lot you have to worry about when it comes to him. I thought he was the defensive MVP this past season.
Yeah.
And in
That's
fact,
good.
Bob Rose, one of our writers here, he's working on this superlatives piece where he talked about, offensive MVP, defensive MVP. But one of the things that he asked was biggest disappointment. My biggest disappointment this year was Marcus May at that safety spot.
Yeah.
And really, if you look over the course of the past couple of years where they signed him, he just has not been the guy that they expected him to be. He's had trouble staying on the field. Of course, he had the suspension as a part of that this season, but even still, struggled with injury. Had a couple of splash moments, a couple of nice plays, things like that. I don't want to take anything away from him, but I don't know if the Saints are really getting, and I'm not alone in this, but I don't really know that the Saints are getting what they wanted out of Marcus May. Then when you see the investment of Jordan Howden pay off his rookie year as a 5th-round draft pick, even though he was kind of playing a position that he'd not really played before. He's a little bit more of a post-free safety kind of guy. He was playing that sort of strong safety box role. But then you saw the last 2 games with Jonathan Abram and the way that he went out there and just brought so much energy to that defense, all that. I think when you have guys that you really like at the position, like Jonathan Abram, like Lonnie Johnson as well, and you have a guy that's not really living up to his contract number and his pay, and you have the opportunity to maybe save a little bit by moving on from him. I think they would save just under $2 million by moving on from him. Not a lot, but still something to consider. If you're not getting the play level that you want out of him anyway, might be time to move on there and look to see if maybe a guy like Jonathan Abram slides into that starting role, or if you can get Jordan Howden trained up at that different position over the course of the offseason.
Yeah, and again, you don't have to talk to any coach, but the best ability is your availability, right? And so we're talking about guys, Thomas, Lattimore, May, just haven't been available for this team, right? And so, again, you got to have some type of plan in place to be able to do that. And so it's going to be fascinating. I think it's going to, obviously once we get down from the Senior Bowl, it's going to be a little bit of a lull, if you will, until we get to the combine. But obviously some big things going to happen. We'll get the OC. Obviously, you're going to have some more restructures done and then kind of heat up as we get into the new league year. But it's still a long ways to go. But let's talk about the Senior Bowl and let's kind of talk about what maybe some of your impressions were. I mean, look, there's a ton of the prospects to be excited about. I know I put a whole bunch of them out that I was really interested in watching, and a lot of them actually did come to the table and did some good things. But, let's just start offensively. Your thoughts and maybe some of the players that you really liked seeing this week.
Yeah, I'll start at the offensive line. We were talking about how big of a need that might be for them, right? This tackle class here in Mobile was awesome. Tlisha Fuaga,
tremendous.
Yeah. Tlisha Fuaga out of Oregon State was just a roadblock. He never moved. He never got moved. I didn't see him lose. He was awesome all week, just an absolute mauler. He's a guy that could be there at 14 for them. That would be a solid 1st-round investment. He looks ready. Yeah. But then because of how good this tackle class is, if you don't go tackle in the 1st round, you could go to a guy like Patrick Paul out of University of Houston, who is also excellent. 6'7", 332 pounds. But even at 6'7", no one ever got under him. He sinks really well, anchors really well. He's got that, just the tree trunk. I'm going to stick my roots in and you're not going to get me off my spot. But he's got the athleticism too. So if we're talking about bringing in for the Saints an offensive coordinator like a Clint Kubiak, you're probably bringing in a little bit of the wide zone offense, the Shanahan offense. And so you're going to run a lot of those outside zone runs. You're going to need a mobile offensive line. So not only are you looking for guys that are going to be really good pass protectors, but you're looking for the guys that are going to be able to move in the run game. And in both those guys, Tlisha Fuaga out of Oregon State, as well as Patrick Paul out of Houston, and a couple other guys, Kingsley Suamataia out of BYU, and a couple others that were out there. They all fit the bill. I mean, this was a really solid class. And we know how much the Saints love their Senior Bowl guys. This is a really solid class of Senior Bowl guys to choose from at a major position of need for them going into 2024.
Yeah, I know the Fuago's on my list. I think he's on everybody's list, like, to be fair. I think it's one of those, it's hard. Like, if you didn't see what you liked on him in college, then it just reinforced what you saw at the Senior Bowl too. A couple of wide receivers I liked. I like Roman Wilson out of Michigan. I like Xavier Legette out of South Carolina. I think those are two on my radar. Of course, do they draft a wide receiver? Yeah, they could potentially. I don't think it's within the top 50 perspective, but it's going to be interesting to see, because I think what we talked about, you got Olave, you're going to have Shaheed, and then obviously A.T. Perry is a big part. If they were to get a Hunter Renfrow, I feel pretty good about that core, but you're always going to look at adding on to it. I thought Jaquan Jackson from Tulane, he had a good week too. I think that he's some of the guys. And so you look at him, you look at all the wide receiver prospects, you look at it, it's going to be a transition tight ends, they had a couple that shined on it. And it's one of those things where I think some of these guys, the bread and butter is really going to be, you got to learn that special teams role in some aspects, not just be a
Yep.
one-dimensional player. And I remember, because we talked about Phil Gallion and we didn't really mention too much, but I remember last year in the draft process, it was Darren Rizzi talking. He said these guys watched the most film of anybody. And I believe that,
Yep.
right? Because you're always
Oh, yeah.
looking for special teams, and anybody that's had special teams backgrounds or has, played a different position, like they played linebacker in school, or they played running back, or played safety, whatever. Those are the type of things that set them apart differently to be able to succeed in the NFL sometimes when you get the right coaching, which, oh, by the way, they finished in second on the Rick Gosselin special teams rankings, which is no
Right.
small feat considering you had an undrafted rookie kicker, a rookie punter, and you had, of course, Rashid Shaheed. But their coverage unit has been good. I know people don't like the Blue Headley stuff, but they get exactly what they want from him. There's minimal
Yep.
returns. I think that obviously works for them in that style. It's different approach. But again, some of these guys at the Senior Bowl, you look at him, a guy like DeMarco Jackson, he was a guy that you look at,
Yep.
he makes his impact and he starts to blossom a little bit more. Sometimes these players aren't just day one, open them out of the can and they're just ready to go. You have to develop them. You have to get good coaching. I think that's the most important thing. That's why, like, when people talk about Jaden Daniels to the Saints, I'm like, no, guys, he's not going to fit the bill. Even if Carmichael was running, like, they would ruin him. It's just like, I get the pipe dreams and stuff, but it's just realistic. It just doesn't work out for some of these guys. But any other people on your offensive side? And then, of course, obviously comment on anything else that you had seen, Saints-wise, prototypes, whatever.
Yeah, let me go to a tight end real quick, because look, we're pretty sure Jimmy Graham's done. I mean, just based on his social media
Seems
posts
like
and stuff like that. Yeah, at the very least, it felt like he was at least saying goodbye to the New Orleans Saints. We'll see what happens all throughout that in terms of maybe a potential retirement that could come or whatever. But
he's going canoeing,
if he's
or he's doing some type of if you didn't see Cam Jordan's thing, go check it out. Sorry, not to interrupt, but I was like, yeah, that's crazy.
No. Yeah, it's incredible the stuff that he's doing. Like, he's living his life, and it's awesome because he absolutely deserves it. He's the guy that should have been on the field for the New Orleans Saints a ton more last year.
Yeah.
So maybe you learn that lesson. You get into 2024 and you go, okay, so now who's the big red zone body? Now, Juwan Johnson showed up, particularly toward the end of the season there, big time, when he really started to be healthy and catch his rhythm toward the end of the year with Derek Carr. But one guy that I really like here in Mobile was Penn State tight end Theo Johnson. 6'6", 257 pounds. At one point was moving 17.85 miles per hour out on the field, which, like,
for tight end,
I'm gonna get out the way. Yeah, I'm gonna get out the way.
That's gonna hurt.
Yeah, I don't want nothing to do with that. And he moves so well too. He's actually a really solid route runner. He ran this pivot route that put a Rutgers defender on skates at one point and all that. Here at the Senior Bowl, you saw some of his ability to be able to do that as well. He's just one of those guys that kind of feels a little bit like an anomaly, but he's not going to be one of the top tight ends with the kid from Georgia drawing so much attention there. So he could be one of those guys that, if the Saints do find a way to get into the third, fourth round, that they could grab, bring him in, and then he could sit back and kind of develop a little bit more as a pass catcher, as opposed to thinking back to years past where you bring in an Adam Troutman. You needed him to develop, but you also needed him on the field. You won't run into that conundrum this year when you've got Juwan Johnson, you've got Foster Moreau, you've got Taysom Hill. You can let Theo Jackson actually develop over time, which would be pretty big for him. So he's a guy that I really liked. And then I'll say running back Cody Schrader as well, out of Missouri. Again, if you're bringing in a Clint Kubiak, you need that outside zone capable player. Cody Schrader can do that with his eyes closed. He's like 5'9", like 205 pounds, 215 pounds, small, compact, kind of Mark Ingram-ish in terms of body build. But if you need him to be able to read and pick one of three holes, it's time to either bounce, bang, or bend. He can do all that extremely well. Makes it look super easy. He was a guy that I really enjoyed watching. Had only caught about just over 20 passes during his time throughout his collegiate career, but we saw him catching passes very comfortably here in Mobile as well.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting you bring it up because I think when you look at the Saints backfield too, they felt good about what Kendre Miller was able to do at the end of the year. Obviously, that was disappointing because he wasn't able to see the field, but I think it gives him a good balance. Alvin, if they can get the right OC, I think the sky's the limit because I think they're not using Kamara the right way. I don't think that Jamal Williams is being used the right way, but Jamal can be their power back. Kendre's kind of their both do it all type, and Kamara can too. It's just they got to find a running scheme that's going to fit and cater to him. It's just too many times where you just like, why did they run that play? Why did they do that? So running back, obviously, they're going to add one at least. Whether it's the drafted process, undrafted process, maybe free agency, they've got to look at that aspect too. Tight end, I like a tight end too. Again, because what I like about this coaching staff, again, most people are saying, oh, well, they got rid of the big ones, but I like the fact keeping Clancy Barone. He's one of the most intelligent guys you'll talk to. He is a guy that I think you can get the most from a development perspective, but they didn't change too many things besides, letting the senior offensive assistant go. And then obviously, with the wide receiver moving on from Cody Burns, which I understand that in some aspects that they wanted something a little bit more, somebody with a little bit more experience for what they're trying to do. But Cody's extremely smart. He's going to land on his feet. But again, you look at the offensive side of this football for the Saints, they're just going to have to figure that out. And I think that, you look at this draft philosophy for the team, they always build within the trenches. So people are going to throw all sorts of different things. I think they're going to look at the trenches for that 14th overall pick. Never say never, but again, I think that's what makes the most sense. And then 45, depending on which again, you look at it, you have to get through free agency first. That's why I always tell people with mock drafts, like, pump the brakes, Holmes, because you got to get through your free agency and figure out what you got, because I think that sets you up for here's what I need in the draft. Because you look at last year, they had Malcolm Roach as the only defensive tackle on the roster at one point. They go out and get Colin Saunders, Nathan Shepard, then they draft Brzee. I mean, there's a method to the madness that some people just don't always see.
Yep, 100%. And even still, I mean, like the opportunity to double up at different positions and everything will be there and all. But you're right. I mean, look, we don't even know the 13 teams that are actually going to pick ahead of the New Orleans Saints, and we don't actually know if it's going to be 13 teams picking ahead of the New Orleans Saints. Like, we have no idea.
Bears taking two at least.
Yeah, we have no idea what's going to happen when it comes to this NFL draft. But certainly, like, looking at it from this point and looking at it out here, the thing that's good is that if you're exploring all the scenarios, what you're learning is even if the Saints went into the draft with this roster, even with the small amount of capital that they have or are set to have, depending upon the compensatory selections and how that all works out, there are players at those positions to help them address some of those holes. Will it be with NFL experience? No. Will it be with, proven experience at, that against you or even on your team before? No. That's why free agency is so valuable. You get the guys with the NFL experience. But the good thing about this year's draft is where the Saints are in need presently, even at this point, the draft has the talent appropriate to supplement those needs.
Yeah. And you talked about compensatory picks. It's 3 projected 5th rounders. So it's David Onyemata, Caden Ellis, and Marcus Davenport that count for the formula. But last I saw is 3 5th rounders. And look, you don't have to feel bad about it. And look, A.T. Perry's a 6th round pick. Jordan Howden, that's the one you got on the day 3 pick. I mean, I think if you look at it and you got your scouting, I think that's where you can get the bread and butter. I can't believe A.T. Perry was still a 6th round pick. I just don't understand that, how he failed that. But
we were looking at each other like, is he ever coming off the board? Like, what's going on here?
I remember
we were both super high on him.
Yeah, and I talked to Cody Burns like in between the draft, and we were just talking about the position. And he had his eyes set on somebody else at one point, but then we were talking. I was like, AT's still on the board. I'm surprised he fell. He's like, really? And so I don't know. Not that I had influenced that pick, but again, it was just funny to have that conversation and just be like, oh, they took A.T. Perry. What a shock! And so, but a lot to figure out. But defensive side of the ball, now you're looking at. I don't think there's too many things to address outside of maybe you might have to look at prioritizing signing some of these free agents. You mentioned Lonnie Johnson. You mentioned Jonathan Abram. I think those are 2 that you have to re-sign or should re-sign. I think Isaac Yiadom is probably your top free agent to re-sign right now at this point, just because of the season. Now, you look at him, again, you know what you get with Lattimore. He can take away half the field, right, when he's on there and when he's on his game. But you look at a guy like Ike Yiadom, I mean, him, Paulson Adebo, which I don't think we talk about enough, had an outstanding year. Alante Taylor, all 3 of those guys were top 10 in the NFL in pass breakups. I mean, I think that's a good testament to Joe Woods and Marcus Robertson for the way they teach the game. I think that's first and foremost. But you look at linebacker question, DeMario, he's getting older. Is it time to look at his replacement? Pete Warner didn't have the greatest year. You didn't get what you needed from the defensive line. Peyton Turner, is this going to be the year he puts it together in a contract year? Are you going to get what you need from Isaiah Foskey? And Cam Jordan obviously played hurt. I think Carl Granderson was probably your best defensive lineman outside of Brian Brzee, which I thought was most pleasantly surprised pick that they had that blossomed this year. But, defensively, where do the Saints need to go? What do you think is their priorities? And then we'll talk more about the Senior Bowl prospects.
Yeah, I think you learned last year, and I think the Saints learned last year that there's real value to having speed and athleticism off the edge. Zach Bond at the end of the season really, really helped that pass rush at the end of the year. You might look at the numbers and go, 2.5 sacks over those last few games. But look, for a team that was sitting in the 30s for the majority of the back half of the year, that was a nice sort of boost to get to your defense. And it wasn't just that Zach Bond was getting to the quarterback. He was creating opportunities for other players to get to the quarterback. His initial rush maybe moved a quarterback off the spot and allowed somebody else to get around, or just moved that quarterback off the spot, got them on the run, delivering inaccurate passes. He also helped quite a bit when those quarterbacks escaped the pocket because he had the speed and athleticism to track them to the sideline, either force them to throw it away, or even in some cases, make the stop. And so I really think you learned last year, if you're the New Orleans Saints, that there's real value to maybe going with the guys that might not be the necessary prototype in terms of 6'4" and above, 270 and above pounds, 260 and above pounds. There's still value to those guys, don't get me wrong, but finding ones that have an adequate amount of speed and athleticism, as opposed to the recent sort of focus on speed to power conversion, Marcus Davenport, Peyton Turner, all that. I could see the value there. And I think the Saints see the value there too. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's some, either by maintaining and keeping Zach Bond, which would be impressive, or by bringing in somebody in the open market or through the draft. I'm not going to be surprised if we see maybe somebody come in at maybe a more slender frame as a pass rusher that kind of breaks the mold from what the New Orleans Saints have done before. I don't think they're going to change their prototype as a whole. I just think adding to it is valuable.
I think it's taught him. I mean, and it seems like, I mean, that's what Bond did in college. You thought you would have done that more. And again, if you're looking at just the sacks, I don't think that's the right thing, because if you look at some of the tape on against the Bucks, he was a nightmare to defend. I mean, that the tackle just had a problem. You can't defend against somebody with that speed and just a quick little move. I mean, it's just tough. And it made Baker Mayfield's, night a terrible one. Right. And so those are types of things that I think when you look at it makes sense. And I thought about, I floated, I don't know what his market value is, because if I'm a 3-4 scheme team, I'm looking at what Bond could potentially do. I might try to look at him, but I think the Saints, they like him as a core special teamer for sure. If they can just use him on those third down sub rushes. I mean, of course he was their base Sam linebacker and such, but again, it's Pete Werner and DeMario at that linebacker spot. But I think the way you look at the way Zach played, you got to give that some consideration. It's whether they pay somebody like him a little bit more to be that guy has a clear role going forward, or you have to find that prototype, or you have to find that type of build, as you mentioned, to be able to get him in here. I think Peyton Turner, especially, we saw it in finale, is he plays in those third down packages as well, but getting those, it all hinges, because a lot of those games they played with the lead too. So you have the pass rush that just puts the clamps down. It makes sense, right? And so we'll look at it, but we'll talk about some Senior Bowl prospects. Two of the ones that I like, with Tavondre Sweat out of Texas. I think this guy is insane. It's just the way he's able to do things. Just a big, probably talking about like a nose tackle type guy. Somebody just plugs up the interior, eats the blocks. He's got some athleticism to him. He's one that stood out to me a little bit this week. And then Peyton Wilson, linebacker from NC State.
Yeah.
I think he's somebody that I think, man, you look at a linebacker. I'm not saying DeMario replacements or anything like that, but somebody that you can have make some impacts for you, learn their role on special teams and stuff. I think that's the biggest thing for these defenders, is that you're not going to come in here and start day one. First of all, you got to learn the process. You got to learn and get acclimated. I mean, we saw that with Davenport, saw that with Turner, seen that practically, I think, every defensive draft pick that's been taken within the first couple of rounds for the Saints. Is you don't get an automatic starting bid if you're on the Saints roster just because you were picked high. I mean, you got to earn it and learn it. And this is a complex defense. Interesting, some of the things we were told in Mobile about how this defense is kind of constructed a little bit for the Saints. But, I think those are two that again they're going to have a high value. I think Sweat's probably a day too early pick, probably, and Wilson. We'll see how he goes, but I think there's some real gems in this Senior Bowl, and obviously want to see more of them when it comes down to it. Because you look at one-on-ones, that caters towards the wide receiver, obviously. And what's
Yep.
interesting is even sitting next to some of the coaches that, you look at it, it's like in college, you can hold a lot more, right? But in the
Yep.
pro game,
Yep.
they're getting flagged just like this because you can't hold like that you do. And so it's going to be a transition for someone. But who were some of yours that stood out?
Yeah, I'll mention. I love both of those guys in the defensive line or in the front seven that you mentioned. Peyton Wilson's probably my top linebacker in this
Mm,
year's draft class. But one of the guys that I also really like over in the defensive line is Darius Robinson. He's a big
mm,
defensive tackle, like 6'4", 6'5", 284 pounds, if I remember correctly, from Missouri. And he's been working as an edge rusher and was really, really just disruptive here in Mobile. But the thing that I actually like about him is that he started off as a 3-tech years ago. They had him playing at
mm.
3-tech on the interior as sort of being this like interior pass rusher. Then they slimmed him down a little bit, but in slimming him down, they didn't have him drop a bunch of weight. They just toned him up. So that's why he's still like 284, and he's out there looking like Megatron. Like the dude is just jacked and like ready to go. And then so then they moved him out to 5-tech, which is like an edge position, but is a little bit more like it was Cam Jordan in college. And Cam Jordan's first year in the NFL, actually, they had him at 5-tech. So he was there as a little bit more of like a run stopper and all that. Here in Mobile, they let him just go after, like pin his ears back and go after the passer. And he was so much fun to watch in that role. Really tenacious, really violent hands, all that. So I liked him a lot. McKinley Jackson was a defensive interior guy that I liked as well out of Texas A&M. Little bowling ball type dude, 6'1", 333 pounds. Kind of reminds me of a Colin Saunders in a way. Very athletic, has a great pair of moves, really violent hands as well. So really enjoyed that. And then there were a couple of corners that stood out too. I don't know how invested the Saints are going to be at corner. That's really going to depend upon who they keep in free agency. But I'll tell you, if they're looking, guys like Quentin Mitchell had a fantastic week. Willie Drew, the corner out of Virginia State, I think it'd be really interesting to see him in the
HBCU
slot.
product.
Yep, yep. The one and only prospect here from HBCU
Yeah.
school.
Says something.
He was the guy that was here that, 5'10", 190 pounds, perfect slot build, good speed, great ball skills, had 7 interceptions last year, several passes defensed as well, jumps routes, really aggressive. So you might have to tone that back a little bit, but that's one of the reasons why that kind of works in the slot, because you have 2 more lines of defense behind you sometimes in the slot. You can be a little bit more aggressive. And so I really liked what we saw from him. And another guy that I liked corner wise was Cam Hart, Notre Dame. Just 6'2", 200 pounds, like just a classic big physical guy that works in this division when you've got big wide receivers and all that. Mike Evans, Drake London. We'll see what Carolina does at wideout. But he's one of those other guys that I really enjoy too. So I don't know. I loved the defense. I thought that the offensive line performed the best as like a position group here in Mobile. But if I had to pick offense or defense about who was most impressive throughout the week, I really loved the defensive guys.
Yeah, and I think they're only going to get better. You'll see some of that showcased in the Senior Bowl, and of course, not that we don't want to talk about quarterbacks or anything like that. Michael Pratt, obviously, Penix, all those types of guys and stuff, but I just don't see that in the mold and mix. Of course, you got to pay attention to quarterbacks and stuff, but I'm with you. I think defense is what's intriguing. Offense, I think we expected. I mean, when you have that many type of offensive tackles that are just such a rich class that of course they're going to look really good. And so again, if you're a team that needs somebody on the trenches, you're going to come away with somebody really good. And so I think it's pretty interesting because I think there's going to be some teams that look at that. I really love what the Lions had done this season. They had the running game, they had Gibbs, they had Montgomery, but they invested in that offensive line and they built it. And so I feel like there's a little bit of jealousy there because they have the weapons, their wide receiving core, not the best. I mean, what you have in Amon-Ra St. Brown, but and some of the other guys, Jameson Williams hadn't done everything, but he come on in the playoffs. And then you look at tight end Sam Laporta, just been outstanding. But again, you look at that, I think there's I don't want to say a mold because it is a kind of copycat league, but I think if you look at a vision of what works sometimes, I think that's a perfect one to look at. And defensively, they have the pieces and they have the coaching. I know it's interesting because DA, he doesn't get out coached a ton when it comes to defensive play, but he did against Sean McVay and the Rams. And so I
Yeah.
think that's why they looked at that Rams tree. They need something that has a little bit more pep in it. And defensively, I think they've got some pieces there that are really going to help them out in the future. But again, you look at this draft, they're going to have some picks. They're going to have some things to deal with. How they go about it right now is going to change completely compared to how they do free agency and how they trade stuff. But it's really interesting because I don't know if I'm going to take this team as a 10-win team next year. I'm not going to make that mistake of kicking them and go to 11-6 or anything, but it's really fun because of these coaches that got hired this year. 5 of the 8 that they're going to play this season, including, the Panthers and obviously the Falcons twice, but it's going to be a really interesting season for the Saints. And, we're fresh off of a bad one, I guess, if you will, or whatever you want to call it, chalk it up.
Yeah, disappointing
it's
one.
bad because they didn't. Yeah, because they were supposed to make the playoffs and they didn't. And so I don't think there's anything to feel good about 9-8 when you don't make the playoffs because, that's just there's no moral victory in that, right? And so Saints got a lot to work to do. They're still got to figure out this OC business. But again, good week in Mobile, a lot of things to build on. What do you think as far as where their next steps are and what they kind of might see from this team going forward?
Yeah, I think the next things that you're going to see, of course, are OC and then filling out the rest of that offensive staff. They'll have some offensive assistants to bring in, the wide receiver coach, running back coach now as well, with Joel Thomas heading over to New York. Talked to Joel Thomas, by the way, and he was nothing but complimentary of his time in New Orleans. But gets an opportunity to, be able to try something new, go somewhere different, go back out to New York and all that. So it's just a great situation. Or go back out to New Jersey for him. So a great situation for him, but really cool to just kind of hear like how much he appreciated his time in New Orleans and everything. And so after that, I think it just comes down to getting ready for free agency. I know everybody wants to jump to the draft, but you're right. Like free agency is right in between. And that's where you make a lot of your biggest strides in terms of what you're able to do. Demario Davis, I know the crowd, the fans are split on Derek Carr, but like those are free agency additions. Drew Brees, free agency addition. You know what I mean? So I think that like these are the places where you really start to build your team, and then the draft is really where you start to build your future and everything. So that's why that becomes really important. And I do think this is a team that needs to get younger. I wouldn't expect too many big splash moves, maybe 1, maybe 2. And they'll be backloaded contracts with low first-year salaries and all the good stuff that we're used to. But then I think that like that becomes really the next big focus. Even with the combine in between, free agency is really the place where you win or lose games for 2024.
Yeah, March 16th is going to be here before we know it. I mean, that's the start of the new league year. There's a lot that's going to happen in between there. It's going to heat up pretty quickly, and it has to, right? And so it's going to be one of those that you look at and you're like, man, how do we get to this point already? I sat here and I'm like, how is the Senior Bowl already here, right? Now, how are we already at the Super Bowl? And sometimes when you cover football, it's like I just don't get how quickly sometimes it goes, and then I think the longest time is when that period between like the last mandatory mini camp and training camp. That's like the longest period of stretch of nothingness for anybody that reports on this team or covers this team. But, it's an exciting time. I think that the Saints team, they've got some questions to answer. They've kind of drew their line in the sand of what's going to happen. I mean, we knew DA was going to be back probably for over a month, before it actually happened. I mean, that was everything that was trending there, right? And it's something that we had talked about, wrote about in Saints News. And again, we got a lot of stuff coming there. It's not just about putting it out on X or Twitter. Read our columns. We got some stuff that we'll throw in there, nuggets and stuff like that. So check all that stuff out. And of course, obviously check out Ross Jackson on Locked On Saints, the Locked On Network. They do phenomenal work over there. And of course, just if you need a daily dose of Saints football, anything, whatever your favorite team is, Locked On is a great network to go check out. I can't say enough good things about these guys over there. But, Ross, tell everybody how you can be followed on Twitter and all that other stuff. I say Twitter. I'm never going to stop saying Twitter. I can't.
No, it's Twitter, man. It's Twitter.
It doesn't work.
No,
it doesn't work.
It's Twitter.
Forever.
Yeah,
Twitter.
I'm with you. I'm with you 100%. Hashtag forever Twitter. No, thanks, man. That's awesome. Yeah, no, you can find the Locked On Saints podcast on YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Of course, all the written work over at Saints News. And you can find it all in one place on really any of your favorite social medias at Ross Jackson NOLA, NOLA. I'm just making sure that it's all brand aligned. Ross Jackson NOLA, you'll be able to find what you're looking for.
Absolutely. And of course, you mentioned Saints News. si.com/NFL/Saints. We are still there. We're definitely going to be kicking. No changes there from it. And I know some people had reached out, and I appreciate that, but nothing that's going to change on our end. But of course, check it out. I'm John Hendrix at John J Hendrix. I need more of my coffee, bro. So I've got it right here.
Yeah, man.
At John J Hendrix on X. It's just like it's the way it's supposed to be spelled. Hendrix, like Jimmy, not like the gin, is my favorite tagline I like to say. But appreciate all you guys' support. Plenty more coming in this offseason, especially the Saints. We'll have more in the Senior Bowl. Stay tuned. Thanks for tuning in.